Um, so there's, in one aspect, Brazil and India are very close to the rest of the BRICS, as they are strong emerging countries worried about status and affirming themselves. And also they are, as you said, closer to the West as being democracies and espousing liberal values. But they're also not strictly Western values. They are democracies in their own rights with differences. And how do these differences matter when they are talking with the US and Europe about the rules of the games? How does it pan out in the years to come? Reestablishing a new world order or new regimes, how do these differences work out?
Okay, well, I think we can look back a little before we look forward. That's part of the, I think a lot of the writing on BRICS is all forward looking, it's speculating where we're going to be. And as a kind of cautious academic, my instinct is always to say, well, what do we know, or what might we know about where we've come from, and then what might that tell us about where we might want to go. And I think in these terms, the position of both countries, certainly through the 1990s, the position of the West was very much, we run the world. We won the Cold War. We're re-establishing whole sets of new rules for the game in terms of the global economy, in terms of security. We are very much the center. You will join us if you're sensible and rational, and if you're liberal. We decide what world order is, and you will hopefully join, but no one really questions what the order is. What's interesting is that even through that period, Brazil and India, they're not in radical opposition. It's not like the 1970s and the Third World and contesting all of the ground rules of a Western order. After all, they are liberalizing economically. There are changes. Brazil is actually liberalizing faster in some ways than India through much of the 1990s. But there is also this clear sense that the rules of the Western liberal order don't suit all countries. That if you are a democratizing, big, developing country, you have different sets of interests to those at the core. Globalization looks different. Globalization, through all of the 1990s, the word itself was actually much more used in other parts of the world than it was in the United States. And in a sense, for obvious reasons. It wasn't a problem. It was just natural. It was just happening. Clinton talked about, this is the direction of history. People start to talk about it much more when it becomes a problem. And of course, it was a problem, a challenge for emerging countries. So if we think about the financial crises of the late 1990s, we have big developing countries, or lots of emerging markets, saying to the West, this isn't right. This system is not functioning properly. It's creating all sorts of negative costs on emerging countries. And it's not illiberal. We're not challenging Western order, but we're saying here is a major aspect of governance which is not working well. And so, we're not in a different world. We're not trying to create a different, but we're saying your liberal order that you're so happy about and you're telling everyone is so great, well, it's not so great for everybody. And, even a government such as that of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who in many ways is wanting to be very much part of a Western liberal order, to re-establish credentials, to become members of more organizations. Particularly by the time we get to the late 1990s, there's this powerful sense that there are aspects of this liberal order which are not working completely well. Cardoso comes back, he meets Clinton and he meets Blair, and he comes back from those meetings saying, I've tried to tell them that the financial crisis needs a different kind of institutional architecture, but they didn't want to listen. For them, you bail out a little few hedging companies and no institutional reform, it was fine. And actually very presciently, he said to them, the crisis we're feeling now in the emerging world, but within 10 years, the crisis will come to the center of the capitalist system. So in a sense, in the 1990s, it wasn't a question of radical challenge, but it was a question still of seeing there are aspects of this order that are not complete, that need change and reform. If we fast forward to where we are, we've been through this recent crisis, and there, again, it's not a matter, I don't think, of radical challenge, of an alternative, you know, the Beijing Consensus or the old 1970s new international economic. It's not that. But we are in a very different world because there isn't this sense that the West has all the answers, that Western institutions are strong and it's just a matter of us joining you. Now we're in a world where actually the nature of the global order, the nature of the institutional order is much, much more open. And we're seeing, therefore, emerging countries have to meet actually a much greater challenge because they have to be much more like direct, responsible, ambitious players who are saying it's not just a question of whether we like or don't like what you do. It's a question of us having to say what we think really ought to happen. So the Chinese clearly having to say, in a way before, their dominant strategy, maybe their rational dominant strategy, was to avoid saying too much. You know, you're doing fine, you're rising, your economy's doing very well. Of course you want to be a member of things. You want to be a member of the WTO. You want to be part of the Security Council. You have permanent membership. But what does China do there? It keeps very quiet. It doesn't really want to say anything. Doesn't want to cause trouble. In a sense, that's very sensible. The system's treating you very well. Why cause trouble? But the thing about the crisis is that suddenly you have to say something. You have to say something about the future of the dollar. In the environment, again, a nice example of where major developing countries were saying, contrary to what is often said in the United States and Europe, we do think climate change is important. We have negotiated a treaty and a set of agreements. It's not perfect, but it was a framework. Then it was a framework that you, particularly the United States, went and abandoned. That took us most of the way through the 1990s and up to the quite recent period. Now we're in a situation where the regime itself or the problem itself is much more unstable and where the United States has come back to the table. So suddenly big emerging countries can't just act negatively. They can't just say, we don't like this, we don't like that, we're going to resist this, we're going to resist that. They have now to say, well, what is it you're going to do? And what's very interesting on climate change is that all of the big emerging economies have come to shift their positions. We still think that you guys should do things first. We still don't think that we should necessarily be tied down in legal and contractual terms. But for two sets of reasons, we do think we should do something. First of all, because the problems themselves are very serious. In our own interests, we think we should be moving to a low carbon economy. We should be making these changes. But also, if you like, in bargaining terms, we can put pressure on particularly the United States by doing what they say we have to do. You have got to come to the table with some offers. Well, we are. We're going to come to the table. We're going to say something. And we're going to say, what are you going to do? And so, again, we're in a very different position from that kind of dominant world in the 1990s, which was, here is this Western order. This is the center of the world. This is the way history's gone. You know, you can join it or not join it. Things are much more fluid, much more interesting, much more exciting now.
Okay. I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.